James was a hard-working man, the kind of person who never hesitated to help others. He worked long hours at an auto repair shop, fixing cars all day. By the time he finished work, the streets were quiet, and most people were already home. That night, he was especially tired. His body ached from working on a tough engine, and all he wanted was to get home, take a shower, and rest. As he drove down a dimly lit road, he noticed something unusual. A car was parked on the side, its hazard lights blinking. At first, he thought it was just another broken-down vehicle, something he saw often in his line of work. But then he saw her. A woman stood beside the car, leaning against it. Even from a distance, he could tell something was wrong. She wasn't just waiting for help. She looked like she was in pain. James slowed down, debating whether he should stop. It was late, and he didn't know the woman. But deep down, he couldn't just drive past someone who needed help. He pulled over, rolled down his window, and called out, "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman turned to him, her face pale, her breathing heavy. "Please, I think my baby's coming," she said weakly, clutching her belly. James' heart skipped a beat. She was pregnant, very pregnant. And from the way she was holding her stomach, it was clear she was in labor. He quickly got out of his car and rushed to her side. Okay, stay calm," he said, trying to steady his own nerves. He had never been in a situation like this before, but he knew one thing. She needed to get to a hospital. Fast. "Do you have someone to call? A husband? Family?" he asked, hoping someone would come for her. She shook her head, wincing in pain. "No, I was driving myself, but my car just stopped working." James glanced at her car. He could probably fix it, but there was no time for that. "All right, we can't wait. I'll take you to the hospital," he said firmly. The woman hesitated for a moment, but she was in too much pain to argue. With his help, she carefully got into James' car. As soon as she was settled, he shut the door, ran around to the driver's seat, and started the engine. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he pulled onto the road, driving as fast as he safely could. He glanced at the woman. She was breathing hard, her hands gripping the seat. "What's your name?" he asked, hoping to distract her from the pain. "Maria," she whispered between deep breaths. "I'm James," he said, giving her a reassuring nod. "Just hang in there, Maria. We're gonna get you there." The hospital wasn't far, but every second felt like an hour. James could hear Maria groaning in pain, and he silently prayed he could get her there in time. He had no idea that this night would change his life forever. James pressed his foot on the gas, his heart pounding as he drove through the quiet streets. The night felt heavier now, as if time itself had slowed down. Maria's breathing was sharp and uneven. Every few seconds, she let out a low groan, gripping the seat tightly. James had never been in a situation like this before. He had seen women in labor in movies, but this was real. And it was happening in his car. "It hurts," Maria whispered, her voice shaking. I know. Just hold on," James said, trying to stay calm. "We're almost there." He wasn't sure if that was true. The hospital wasn't too far, but with every red light and turn, it felt like it kept getting farther away. James glanced at the dashboard clock. It had only been a few minutes since they left, but it felt like an hour. Maria clutched her stomach and let out a small cry. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He wished he could do more. He wished he knew how to help, but all he could do was drive as fast as possible while still being careful. The streets were mostly empty, but James knew he couldn't take any chances. He didn't want to get into an accident, not now. Still, his heart told him he needed to go faster. He took a deep breath and gently pressed harder on the gas. "Do you have any family nearby?" James asked, hoping to distract her from the pain. Maria shook her head weakly. "My husband. He's working. I couldn't reach him." James could hear the fear in her voice. She was alone, going through one of the scariest moments of her life. He wasn't sure what to say to make her feel better, but he knew he had to try. "You're not alone," he said firmly. "I'm here, and we're gonna get you there, okay?" Maria gave a small nod, but her face was tense. James could see sweat forming on her forehead. He knew she was in a lot of pain. Just then, they reached an intersection, and James groaned as he saw the traffic light turn red. He slowed down, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel anxiously. The street was empty. No cars were coming from either direction. He hesitated for a moment, then made a decision. "I'm sorry, but we don't have time for this," he muttered. Checking both sides carefully, he drove through the red light. His heart pounded, hoping no police were around. He wasn't trying to break the law. He was just trying to save a life. Maria let out another cry, making James' stomach twist. He didn't know much about labor, but he knew one thing. It was happening fast. "We're almost there," James repeated, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it for Maria or himself. Then, as if the night wasn't intense enough, flashing red and blue lights appeared behind him. A police car. James' stomach dropped. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. The siren blared, signaling him to pull over. For a second, he considered ignoring it, but he knew that would only make things worse. Slowly, he pulled to the side, rolling down his window as the officer approached. Before the officer could even speak, Maria let out a loud scream. The officer's eyes widened in shock. "She's in labor," James said quickly, pointing at Maria. "I was just trying to get her to the hospital." The officer took one look at Maria, who was now breathing heavily, clearly in pain, and nodded. "Follow me," he said before rushing back to his car. James let out a breath of relief as the police car sped ahead, leading the way. With the siren clearing the road for them, James followed, driving faster than before. Within minutes, the bright lights of the hospital came into view. James had never been so happy to see a building in his life. He pulled up to the emergency entrance and jumped out, calling for help. A team of nurses and doctors rushed out with a wheelchair, carefully helping Maria inside. James stepped back, watching as she disappeared through the hospital doors. For a moment, he just stood there, catching his breath. He had done his part. Maria was in safe hands now. As relief washed over him, he had no idea that this one night would change his life forever. James stood outside the hospital, his hands resting on his knees as he took a deep breath. The night had been more intense than he had ever expected. His heart was still racing, and his mind was trying to process everything that had just happened. One moment, he was driving home after a long day at work, and the next, he was rushing a stranger to the hospital, praying that she and her baby would be okay. As he straightened up, he watched through the glass doors as the nurses wheeled Maria down a long hallway. A doctor walked beside her, asking questions, while another nurse checked her pulse. James could see the pain on her face, but she was in the right place now. She was safe. A part of him wanted to stay, to wait and see if everything went well. But then he stopped himself. Who was he to her? Just a stranger who happened to be there when she needed help. Her family would arrive soon, and she wouldn't even remember him after all of this. That was okay. He hadn't helped her for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. With a tired sigh, James turned away from the hospital and walked back to his car. The streets were still mostly empty, and the cool night air helped him relax. He slid into the driver's seat, resting his head against the steering wheel for a moment. His body was exhausted, but his mind was wide awake. As he reached for the ignition, he noticed something on the passenger seat, Maria's phone. He picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The screen was cracked slightly, probably from when she dropped it earlier. James sighed. She would need this to call her husband, her family, whoever was important to her. For a brief moment, he thought about going back inside to return it, but then he hesitated. The hospital was busy. Security probably wouldn't just let him walk in and hand it to her. He decided he would come back in the morning. She would still be there, and he could give it to her then. With that, he started his car and drove home. The drive was quiet, but his mind kept replaying the night's events. The way Maria had clutched her stomach, the fear in her eyes, the urgency in her voice. He had never seen someone in that much pain before. It made him realize how unpredictable life could be. 1 second, everything was normal, and the next, it was chaos. By the time he reached his small apartment, the sky was already turning a deep shade of blue. Morning was coming. James yawned as he stepped inside, tossing his keys on the table. His body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He barely had the energy to change his clothes before collapsing onto his bed. But even as his eyes closed, his mind refused to rest. He kept wondering if Maria was okay. Had she given birth yet? Was the baby healthy? He had never felt so invested in a stranger's life before. Why did this feel so different? Eventually, exhaustion won, and he drifted off to sleep. The next morning, James woke up later than usual. His body ached from the previous night, but his first thought was Maria. He grabbed her phone from the table and decided to return it before heading to work. As he reached the hospital, he walked up to the front desk. "Hey, I brought this for a patient. Her name is Maria," he said, placing the phone on the counter. The nurse gave him a puzzled look. "Maria? Do you know her last name?" James hesitated. He didn't. He realized then that he knew almost nothing about her except for her first name, and that she had been in labor. "I don't, but I brought her here last night," he explained. The nurse checked the records, then looked up at him with a polite smile. "I'm sorry, but we can't share patient details. If she left something with you, you can leave it here, and we'll try to return it." James nodded, placing the phone down. "Just make sure she gets it." As he walked away, he felt a strange emptiness. He would probably never see Maria again. That chapter was over. At least, that's what he thought. Because by the time he got back to his car and started driving to work, he noticed something strange. A black motorcycle was following him. James glanced at his rearview mirror again. The black motorcycle was still there. At first, he thought nothing of it. Motorcycles were common on the road, and maybe this one just happened to be going in the same direction. But after a few more turns, the uneasy feeling in his stomach grew. Every time he switched lanes, the motorcycle followed. Every time he slowed down, it slowed too. This wasn't a coincidence. James' hands tightened around the steering wheel. Who was this, and why were they following him? His mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was just some random person heading the same way. Or maybe, was it the police? He had run a red light last night, and though the officer helped him afterward, maybe there were still consequences. But no, that didn't make sense. A cop wouldn't be following him like this. Then another thought hit him, a darker one. Did someone see him help Maria last night? Was someone angry about it? The world could be a strange place, and not everyone liked to see a black man helping a stranger in the middle of the night. He shook his head. No, don't jump to conclusions. Stay calm. To test his suspicion, James made an unexpected right turn down a quiet street. It wasn't the way to his job, but he needed to see if the motorcycle would follow. It did. James' heart started pounding harder. Whoever this was, they were definitely following him. His first instinct was to speed up, to lose them. But something held him back. If this person really wanted to harm him, a chase could make things worse. He needed to think smart. A gas station appeared ahead, and James quickly pulled in. He parked near the entrance and turned off his car, acting as if he was just stopping for fuel. If the motorcycle was truly following him, the rider would have to make a decision now. He watched in his mirror as the motorcycle slowed down and parked a few feet away. The rider didn't take off their helmet immediately. They just sat there, watching him. James took a deep breath. Enough. He wasn't the type to run away from things. He stepped out of his car and turned toward the rider. "Hey," he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "You've been following me. What's going on?" The rider hesitated, then finally removed their helmet. James was surprised to see a man, probably in his late 20s, with short dark hair and sharp eyes. His face looked familiar, but James couldn't place him. The man stepped forward, his face serious. "Are you the guy who took Maria to the hospital last night?" James blinked in confusion. He hadn't expected that question. "Yeah, I did. Who are you?" The man let out a deep sigh, as if he had been holding his breath for hours. Then, to James' complete surprise, he reached out his hand. "I'm Carlos," the man said, "Maria's husband." James hesitated for a second, still unsure of what was happening. But then he shook Carlos' hand, feeling the tension in the air slowly fade. "I've been looking for you," Carlos said. "I needed to find you." James raised an eyebrow. "Why?" Carlos looked James straight in the eye. "Because you saved my wife and my baby. And I needed to thank you in person." James let out a small breath of relief. He had been preparing for trouble, but instead he had found gratitude. Still, he had no idea that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. James stared at Carlos, still processing his words. The tension in his body slowly eased, but his mind was racing. Maria's husband. He had been so sure that the motorcycle following him meant trouble, but now, standing in front of Carlos, he realized it was something else entirely. Carlos ran a hand through his short hair and sighed. "Man, I've been looking for you all morning," he said. "Maria told me what happened last night. She said she wouldn't have made it to the hospital without you." James shifted on his feet. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. "I just did what anyone would do," he said, shrugging. Carlos shook his head. "No, you didn't. A lot of people would have just kept driving. You stopped. You helped her. And because of you, my wife and my baby are safe." Hearing those words made something inside James warm. He hadn't done it for thanks, but knowing that Maria and her baby were okay filled him with relief. "How are they?" James asked. "Is the baby here yet?" Carlos' face lit up with a smile. "Yeah, a little baby girl. Born early this morning. Maria's doing well too. She asked me to find you and thank you." James nodded, feeling a strange sense of happiness for a woman he barely knew. He thought about Maria, how scared she had looked last night, and now she was holding her newborn baby. Life could change so fast. Carlos reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a folded envelope. He held it out to James. "What's this?" James asked. Carlos pushed it toward him. "It's just a small thank you. Please, take it." James hesitated, then slowly took the envelope. Inside, he saw a stack of cash. His eyes widened. This wasn't just a small thank you. It was a lot of money. "Wait, no. I can't take this," James said, trying to hand it back. Carlos shook his head. "Please, I know you didn't do this for money, but you have no idea how much this means to us. My wife and daughter are alive because of you." James looked down at the envelope again. He wasn't rich. He worked long hours just to pay his bills. This money could really help him. But still, it didn't feel right. Carlos must have seen the hesitation in his eyes. "Listen," he said. "If you don't want to take it for yourself, use it for something good. Help someone else, the way you helped us." That made James pause. Maybe it wasn't about the money itself. Maybe it was about what it could do. Finally, he nodded. "All right. Thank you." Carlos smiled, and for the first time, James saw how much this moment meant to him. "You're a good man, James," he said. "I hope we meet again someday." With that, Carlos put his helmet back on, gave James a grateful nod, and rode away. James stood there for a moment, watching as the motorcycle disappeared down the road. He had started the day thinking he would never see Maria again. Now he had met her husband, learned about the baby's birth, and even received an unexpected gift. As he got back into his car, James couldn't help but wonder. Had last night happened by chance, or was there a reason fate had put him on that road at the right time? One thing was certain. His life didn't feel the same anymore, and somehow he knew this was just the beginning. James sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the envelope in his hands. The weight of it felt heavier than just money. It carried gratitude, trust, and something else, a sense of responsibility. He could still hear Carlos' words in his head. If you don't want to take it for yourself, use it for something good. James wasn't used to being in this kind of situation. He worked hard for every dollar he earned, and no one had ever handed him this much money before. Part of him wanted to keep it, pay off some bills, fix his car, maybe even save a little. But another part of him knew Carlos was right. He hadn't helped Maria for a reward. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. James sighed and tucked the envelope into his glove compartment. He didn't know what he would do with it yet, but he had a feeling that when the time came, he would know. Shaking off the deep thoughts, he started his car and drove toward work. The day passed in a blur. James worked at a small auto repair shop, fixing up cars, changing tires, and handling customers who didn't always appreciate how much effort went into keeping their vehicles running. Normally, he just focused on his job, but today, his mind kept drifting back to Maria, the baby, and Carlos. At lunchtime, he sat outside the shop, eating a sandwich and scrolling through his phone. That's when he saw something that made him pause. A community post about a single mother named Lisa struggling to pay for her son's surgery. She had set up a small donation page, hoping for help. The boy, barely 5 years old, had a medical condition that required urgent treatment. James clicked on the link and read through the story. Lisa worked 2 jobs, but the hospital bills were too much for her. She had already sold her car and was walking miles every day just to get to work. James stared at the screen, his heart heavy. This is what Carlos meant, isn't it? Without thinking too much, he reached for his wallet and pulled out his bank card. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he typed in the amount. He didn't send all the money. He still needed to survive too. But he sent more than he had ever donated to anything before. As soon as he pressed confirm, a wave of emotions hit him. It felt right. It felt good. For the rest of the day, James felt lighter. It wasn't about the money. It was about doing something that mattered. As he locked up the shop that evening, his boss, Mr. Reynolds, walked over. "James, you got a minute?" James wiped his hands on a rag and nodded. "Yeah, what's up?" Mr. Reynolds studied him for a second, then said, "I've been watching you. You're one of the hardest workers I've got. And I know you've been struggling a bit lately. I was thinking, it's time you got a raise." James blinked, stunned. "Wait, seriously?" Mr. Reynolds chuckled. "Yeah, seriously. You deserve it." James felt a smile spread across his face. Just that morning, he had given away money to help a stranger. And now, without asking for anything, life had found a way to give him something back. Maybe that was how things worked. You put good out into the world, and somehow it found its way back to you. As James drove home that night, he looked up at the sky and smiled. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was on the right path. James walked into his apartment, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and excitement. So much had happened in the last 24 hours that he barely had time to process it all. He dropped his keys on the small table near the door and sat down on the couch, leaning his head back. Everything was changing, and for once, it felt like it was changing for the better. The raise at work was a blessing, and knowing he had helped Lisa and her son gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. But deep down, James knew this wasn't just about luck. It was about choices. He had chosen to stop and help Maria. He had chosen to accept Carlos' gratitude. He had chosen to help someone else in need. And now, life seemed to be responding in ways he never expected. As he sat there, his phone buzzed. He picked it up and saw a message from an unknown number. Hey, James. It's Carlos. Hope you don't mind me getting your number from the hospital. Maria really wants to see you. Let me know if you're free. James smiled as he typed back. Of course. Just tell me when and where. A few minutes later, Carlos sent the address. It was the hospital. Maria was still there, recovering. James didn't waste time. He grabbed his jacket, got in his car, and drove over. When he arrived at the hospital room, Carlos greeted him at the door. Hey, man. Thanks for coming. Inside, Maria was sitting up in bed, holding her newborn daughter in her arms. Her face lit up when she saw James. Oh my God, you came, she said, her voice filled with happiness. I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. James smiled. Of course, I had to make sure you and the baby were okay. Maria looked down at her daughter, her eyes soft. We're more than okay. Because of you. She glanced up and wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. I don't even know how to thank you. James shook his head. You don't have to. Seeing you both safe is enough. Carlos chuckled. Well, she's been talking about you nonstop since last night. She even has an idea. Maria grinned. I want you to meet my daughter. She carefully lifted the tiny baby, wrapped in a soft pink blanket. Her name is Hope. James felt a lump in his throat. That's a beautiful name. Maria nodded. Because that's what you gave me last night. When I was scared and alone, you gave me hope. James had no words. He just stood there, overwhelmed by the moment. Maria gently reached out and placed Hope's tiny hand in James' palm. I want her to know that a stranger's kindness brought her into this world safely. I want her to grow up knowing that there are good people out there. James looked down at the baby's delicate fingers curled around his. Something in his heart shifted. He had never imagined that stopping for a stranger would lead to something so deep, so meaningful. Carlos placed a hand on his shoulder. You're family to us now, James. And family always stays in touch. James smiled, his heart full. He had always thought of himself as just another guy, going through life one day at a time. But now he realized that sometimes the smallest choices could make the biggest difference. And in that hospital room, holding the tiny hand of a newborn named Hope, he felt like he had truly found something he never expected. A connection that would last a lifetime. James left the hospital that evening with a heart full of emotions. The warmth of Maria's words, the tiny hand of baby Hope in his palm, and Carlos' grateful smile. Everything felt like a moment he would never forget. As he drove home, he thought about how much had changed in such a short time. Just a day ago, he was going about his normal routine, unaware that one small decision would change his life. Stopping to help a stranger had led to something much bigger than he ever imagined. When he reached his apartment, he sat in his car for a moment, looking out at the dark sky. The city lights flickered in the distance, and a peaceful feeling settled over him. He had never been the type to believe in fate, but maybe, just maybe, everything had happened for a reason. The next morning, James woke up feeling different. There was a new sense of purpose in his heart, as if he was meant to do more. He got ready for work, grabbed his things, and headed out. At the auto repair shop, things were the same as always. Cars lined up, customers waiting, and the smell of oil and grease in the air. But James wasn't the same. As he worked, his boss, Mr. Reynolds, walked up to him. James, I forgot to mention something yesterday, he said. There's an opening for a supervisor position. I think you'd be a great fit. James nearly dropped the wrench in his hand. Me? A supervisor? Mr. Reynolds nodded. You've got the skills. And more importantly, you've got the heart. This job isn't just about fixing cars. It's about helping people. And I've seen the way you treat customers. You care. That's rare. James was speechless. A promotion. More responsibility. More pay. Just 2 days ago, he had been struggling to make ends meet, and now life was offering him more than he ever expected. After work, he decided to take a walk instead of heading straight home. As he passed by a small cafe, he noticed someone sitting by the window. Lisa, the single mother he had donated money to. She was holding her son's hand, smiling as they shared a meal. The little boy looked happy and full of energy. Healthy. James stopped in his tracks. Could it be? Did his donation help her get the surgery her son needed? He didn't want to intrude, but as he turned to walk away, Lisa looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, she just stared, as if trying to place where she had seen him before. Then, slowly, realization spread across her face. She stood up, hesitating for just a second before walking toward him. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you the one who donated?" James wasn't sure how she knew, but he nodded. Lisa's eyes filled with tears. "I don't even know how to thank you," she whispered. "That money, it changed everything. My son got the surgery he needed, and now he's going to be okay." James felt his chest tighten. He looked down at the boy, who smiled up at him with bright, innocent eyes. "You saved us," Lisa said, her voice shaking. James shook his head. "No, I didn't. I just did what I could." Lisa reached out and squeezed his hand. And that was enough. As James walked home that night, he felt something inside him shift again. This was what Carlos meant. Helping one person had led to something bigger, and now it had happened again. James realized that life wasn't just about getting through each day. It was about the choices you made, the kindness you gave, and the lives you touched. As he looked up at the stars, he smiled. Because now he knew his purpose. And this was just the beginning.